Hello, I'm Brian Galbraith. I'm the owner of Galbraith Family Law, which is a law firm of divorce and family law lawyers. We have offices in Barrie and Newmarket and Toronto. And I'm really, really honored and pleased to have in conversation with me today, Minni Sharma. She's a divorce and relationship specialist, registered psychotherapist. So she really has a deeper understanding of what's going on for clients and people who are going through a separation and divorce, especially right now during this pandemic, how tough it is. And so what we're going to talk about is how it's it's a grief that people experience. Let's start with you and your experience. You're a registered psychotherapist, and you've worked with the trauma center with first responders and women's shelters, rape crisis centers, hospices, high schools. What haven't you done? Man, you've worked with a variety of people, right?
I have, yep. And I have to.
Now you've indicated you're in Stouffville, but you're doing this virtually, right? Like all the rest of us. So anybody in Ontario, I guess, could reach out to you and you'd be able to serve them, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
So tell us, the first slide is about changes in divorce and what that's all about. And when we were talking about this before we began, you said it's so important how you start your divorce process, right? Tell me about
exactly. I mean, I find working with clients and parents in particular, and I always say this, is how you begin the divorce or separation process is pretty much how it's going to end. So what I mean by that is your attitude, your energy. You know, we talk about, lawyers, family professionals, therapists talk about, you got to love your children more than you dislike your ex. All of that really kind of impacts the journey of your separation and divorce. And that's directly related to how healthy the journey is going to be, which is directly related to your grief journey and the losses that you're going to have. So it's very important to really look at the bigger picture of this. What are your goals? How do you want to design this process? Who's your team? Taking care of yourself, self-care, so that you can be present to your children. Because it's a really, really tough thing. And even though more than 40% of Canadians will go through a divorce in their lifetime, every situation is unique. Everybody has different coping tools. Everybody has different support systems. So it's really, really important to draw on those resources, that whatever you have, in order to make sure you have a healthier separation or divorce, hence healthier grief journey, if that makes sense.
Right, because the idea is that separation and divorce is a grief journey, and that's all about loss. There's so much that someone who's going through a separation or divorce is losing, and it's grieving that loss. Is that kind of like what this slide talks about? What is grief? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, grief is the natural response. And I want to be very clear, because I hear, and you're probably going to get people, asking questions and saying, I'm not grieving. I'm so happy I left my ex. It was the best thing I ever did.
Right.
And I want to be clear that grief isn't just about the loss of your ex, that particular person, their personality. It's the idea of that person, your hopes and your dreams. So even if you were the one who initiated the separation, you were the one who maybe caused the divorce or separation, there's still a grief process. There's still many, many losses that people don't talk about. And we'll go through some of the really big ones, and there's so many little small ones. But, sadness, loneliness are words that come to mind when we talk about the grief journey. And with the losses that we're going to talk about, even though, like I was saying, so many people get divorced in Canada, there's not often a lot of compassion, I would say, around it. It's that attitude of, well, you chose to get married to that person, so you're choosing to get divorced, get over it, move on. And what people don't realize is that divorce is second to death in terms of our psychological or physiological response. Our body goes through pretty much the same thing that we would go through if we lost a loved one through death.
Right.
That's pretty huge. That's pretty
Yeah.
huge, right? Right. And, which kind of, I think one of the slides where we talk about what disenfranchised grief is, I don't know if we want to maybe, well, let's talk a little bit about more, I guess, what grief is, and we'll talk about disenfranchised grief. So some of you may have heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's kind of the guru of grief. She wrote a book, and she later came and said, no, like when I talked about the stages of grief, it didn't mean that it was this smooth process. You finish one stage. So there's anger, there's denial, there's depression, there's bargaining. And then, you come to the goal, which is acceptance. That it's not these clear-cut, wonderful stages that we go through. It looks nothing like that. It's all over the place. And the goal of grief, especially in divorce, well, any grief journey, but particularly because we're talking about divorce and separation today, is acceptance. So what does acceptance mean? Acceptance does not mean like, oh, well, our marriage sucked, so, we'll just move on. It was probably really hard, and it was there's probably a lot of pain there. The acceptance that we're talking about therapeutically is, I am going to be okay. My kids are going to be okay. We're not wonderful. We're not great. This isn't the best thing that ever happened. Sometimes it is, but it's still a difficult journey. We're going to be okay.
Right? Isn't part of that acceptance starting to find a new identity, right? And
absolutely.
To say, this is who I am now, and I've got to be responsible for my own happiness going forward, and right. But that's hard when you're when there's this big loss and this cloud of grief that follows you everywhere you go.
Well, that's a huge loss that we'll talk about a little bit more later, is your loss of your identity as a husband or a wife, a spouse, a partner, or whatever you want to call it, whether it's in heterosexual couples, same-sex couples. There's huge losses in your identity of who you were and kind of where you belonged, right? And that's really difficult because now you're out in the world as a single person. And I kind of joke around about this, that like divorced people, including myself, are like these dark souls just floating around looking for love because we're so desperately want it. But then we bump into each other and we're like, no, I can't, right? We put up these walls because we've been so hurt. And there's so many challenges to that. So, now to identify as a single person, single mom, single dad, that's a whole journey in itself. We won't even get into, the dating world and, what a jungle that is. That's a whole other webinar. But, it's a huge shift from I was a wife, I was a husband, I was a partner for so many years to, oh, I'm single. And with that comes, again, those words, sadness and loneliness. Again, it doesn't always mean that you're really sad about losing your particular ex. That might be a really good thing if it was a very unhealthy dynamic. It's positive. It means that I identified myself as a husband or wife or partner. Now I no longer have that title. Right? So who am I? Who am I? Am I Ms. MS? Am I, Miss MISS? Like, there's so many facets to that journey of who we are and how we want to present ourselves.
Right? And you touched on that there's it's kind of a lack of sympathy, and you feel it. You can feel that people. I remember when I went through my own divorce, which was, I don't know, 16, 17 years ago, that clients would actually laugh. They thought it was hilarious that their divorce lawyer was going through a divorce, right? There was absolutely no sympathy whatsoever. And the other thing that you touched on is loneliness. That is rampant during this, during this pandemic and lockdowns and so on. People are lonely. And so when you go through a divorce during a pandemic, oh my goodness, it must be so tremendously more isolating.
It is the worst time to break up. Brian, you and I were just talking about this, that, the regular supports that we would have, going to the gym, going out to coffee with friends, going to your parents for dinner when you're feeling sad or alone. We don't have that right now.
Right.
So, wow, the losses on top of the losses, and your ability to call on your resources is very limited. So it's a much more challenging time to separate right now. But we know, you and I were kind of talking about after, China went into lockdown, that divorce rates went up like 800% or something crazy.
Yeah, and we've seen a huge increase in people contacting us about their separation and divorce, and I think it's just that, if you've got a bad relationship, pre-pandemic, you could kind of avoid each other. You could find other distractions, other supports, and other ways to get through the day. But during the lockdown, and when you're stuck at home with each other all the time, a bad relationship can get worse. And we've seen that actually. The amount of domestic violence has, increased manyfold during this pandemic because people are losing their mind.
Absolutely. And I want to preface this before we talk any further too, that when we're talking about the grief journey today, it does not include domestic violence. It does not include abusive relationships. That's, again, a whole other webinar. I worked at a women's shelter for many years. I managed a rape crisis center, and the abuse of power is not necessarily, yes, there's certain things in terms of the grief journey that would be similar, but it's a whole other ballgame, whole other world. So we're going to park that because I don't think that that's even a fair assumption to say that, people who've been in abusive relationships are going to be going through a similar grief journey or some of the things that we're talking about today. So let's preface that, but you're absolutely correct. Humans are not actually even designed we're social, right? We need to be out there. And this whole concept of, like Hollywood, your partner's your everything, you complete me. It's yes. That's not possible. It's not humanly possible. That's why it's important to balance and have, your friends, your journal, your gym, your meditation, whatever it is, as your support systems, because your partner cannot be everything. So, and you'll notice with unhealthy relationships that end, that often if they were relying on their partner to be their everything, they have a much more difficult grief journey because they weren't kind of spreading out their resources and support systems. They were relying on one person for their happiness. That person did not make them happy. Now they're really lonely because they don't have that person, but they forgot to balance everything else, right?
And it's so hard to achieve that balance during this pandemic because you can't go to the gym, you can't go out with your guy friends or your girlfriends. Those supports are gone. So these people are. It's just an added level of stress and grief. You talked about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross saying it's not, you do stage 1 check, stage 2 check, right? It's you go all over, right?
And life is kind of like that, right? It's like 10 steps forward, 5 steps back, 5 steps forward, 3 steps back. So it kind of looks like that. But yes, let's show this. This is really what it looks like.
Exactly. I love this slide. The experience is all over the place. Yeah.
It's all over the place. And that's the reality of the grief journey. So the first part, which is the stages of grief, we would hope it would kind of look like that. And yes, we do experience most of those emotions for sure, right? Absolutely. And when we're getting into the loss of adjustment in the first part, that's really the acceptance part of it, right? You're identifying yourself as someone new, you're forming new relationships, new support systems, etc. But in reality, it's my experience, as you can see, is all over the place. And again, this is something that people don't really talk about. Like I have clients coming to me saying, I thought I was like over my divorce. It happened 6 years ago. I worked on it. I went to therapy. I was fine. And then I was at the mall and someone walked by with his cologne and boom, it hit me.
Right.
And I went right back into the depression and right back into the anger and resentment. And I was like, yes. It's interesting about grief is the events that we anticipate the anticipation is usually worse than the actual event. So anniversaries, oh, this is the day we first met, or this was our wedding date. Those are hard, but we are a little bit psychologically prepared for them. So I will say that grief will hit you when you're least expecting it. And these are the triggers, right? So smells, right? Those are a huge trigger. Someone looks like your ex. Someone says a line that your ex used to say. Your favorite show that you guys used to watch together comes on. Those are all triggers that we don't really expect to feel anything, but then we do. And we're like, what just happened? I thought it was good. Right. And again, this doesn't mean that you necessarily like, oh, I love my ex so much. I miss them so much. I want to be with them. It's again, the hopes and dreams that you had. I don't know anybody. Maybe there are a few people who get married and go, let's see if it works out. I don't know. Most people go into it really like, this is my person. I want to spend the rest of my life with this person. You have your hopes, you have your dreams, you view retirement with them and raising children with them, and then it's gone. Yeah. And there's so much pain in that, right? There's so much pain.
And I think it's harder for those people who have children together because they're still connected, right? They still have that, they can't, distance themselves from their ex because they still have to find a way to co-parent.
Absolutely. And you probably have noticed this too, Brian, often we see the worst of our partners when we're going through separation, not their best. Emotions are high. We're negotiating our lives. We're negotiating our finances. We're negotiating our children and what life is going to look like. So anger, resentment, fear is huge. That often drives everything. And we're now trying to make decisions about our life. That is really, really scary. So working through those emotions, especially the fear and the losses and the grief, that's going to be one of the most challenging parts of going through the separation and divorce, right? Is really, and also touching on all the emotions that you're going to feel. So, yeah, there's a lot. Well, children will always bond you.
We always so often what sidetracks the negotiations for lawyers is our client's emotions or the other party's emotions, and that can make it so much worse, and so that's why we always encourage our clients to work with somebody like you who can help them navigate that emotional journey and help them understand the grief that they're going through, right? Because that's part of it. I assume is one of the first things is to understand grief and what they're experiencing, and so that they can recognize it in themselves and to normalize it, because it's so. I think you went through your own divorce, and it's a tough journey. And when you, as a divorce lawyer, I thought I would be immune from it because I've dealt with hundreds of divorces, but I went through the same emotional journey, ups and downs, and that feeling of having a dark cloud over my head everywhere I went until things got resolved. And yeah, it's hard.
Oh yeah, I would say, we talked a little bit, you and I, before about loneliness and feeling lonely, which is a huge part of the grief journey that we're talking about in terms of a loss of your identity. And I remember going to the first wedding alone, and sitting at a table of couples and the feeling, and luckily, culturally speaking, we kind of segregate anyways, where the guys kind of hang out and the women kind of hang out separately, so it wasn't so bad. But I remember coming home that night and alone, because my kids were at their father's, unlocking that door. I can still visualize that, the key, opening the door to an empty house, shutting the door, and just bawling and crying and being like, holy, this is real. This is real. I am alone. I'm really alone. And of course, going to a wedding is a bit of a trigger, right?
Right.
Hopes and those dreams. And I remember going up to bed by myself going, okay, Minni, this is it. This is real. And it's funny how it hits you at certain moments that you don't really expect, because I psychologically prepared. I was so happy to go to this wedding, and but you don't know when grief is going to hit you. And it's often the unexpected moments that are the most difficult, the triggers, right?
For sure. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. I
those are
wanted
hard.
to share the screen. You talked about what grief looks like in separation. You briefly touched on a disenfranchised grief society. What does that
I'm going to
mean?
talk about that in a second, but just before with that crazy, my experience, I just wanted to say about that you can actually experience all those emotions at the same time. You
Oh
can
yeah,
get to a place of acceptance, I'm okay, and then go back to anger and resentment or denial or bargaining.
right,
Like, what if we had just done this, or what if we just did more, couples counseling? Maybe we would still be together. And I always say to all my parents, leave no stone unturned before
yeah,
you go down the separation path, because the worst thing in life is regret, right? We don't want
right,
regret. So do not be surprised if you're feeling 2 or 3 or 5 or all of these emotions at once, or you jump from one and back to the other, and then you're okay, you're in acceptance, and then again you smell that cologne or perfume and you're back to anger.
right.
Be very kind and gentle with yourself, because it will happen, and it sometimes it happens many years later.
Yeah,
You're fine
it,
and boom.
it's so normal, and but it's still hard. Even though you know it's normal, it's still hard to take. It's painful, right? So,
Yeah, there's no magic, potion or date when you're like, oh, after a year or 6 months, you're going to be fine. Everybody's so different. And it's really highly dependent on your support system.
so
If you
you don't
have,
have a magic wand, Minnie, and
I
you're not
wish I
working.
did. I wish I did. I honestly would give it to, my magic to everybody, because grief is very painful. So talking about disenfranchised grief, which is, interesting, is when someone you love dies, you can call into work and say, hey, you know what, I'm not having a good day. My mother just died 2 days ago. I can't come into work. And they're going to be like, yeah, Minnie, no, for sure. We understand. Take a day off. Okay. Imagine calling into work saying, you know what, I just separated from my husband or wife like 3 days ago. I'm having a hard day, and you work at a bank or, a big financial, and they're like, what? Get your get your butt into work, right? Like, disenfranchised grief is exactly that. It's our society doesn't recognize it as grief. So there's this lack of compassion, lack of empathy, generally speaking, from society when you go through a divorce. And we talked about how it's very similar to death. And that leads to a very lonely, isolating experience, right? Even if you have friends that have gone through divorce or separation, oh, I got through it. I'm fine. You'll be fine. Just do this. Just, go out and date or whatever it is. But when you're in it, when you're in the eye of the storm, it doesn't matter how much theory and knowledge you have. I was a mess. We'll talk about some of the big losses. And for me, I was a stay-at-home mom for 10 years. And to not see my children every day, I still might cry today. That was, it's so hard. It was the
Yeah,
most difficult thing I probably have ever had to go through. um you're like, I'm not a full-time parent. What? I was born to do this job. How dare this happen? That's a really big one. I found that was the biggest one for me. The biggest loss was not being a full-time parent and
yeah,
seeing your children on
absolutely.
a daily basis. That was very painful, right? So disenfranchised grief, again, be kind and gentle with yourself. Society may not be understanding about it. um, and it can be often isolating and lonely because of that, right? Some people can't talk to their bosses about it, or even their parents or family members, because nobody wants to upset you, so they don't bring it up.
Right.
At the dinner table, like, let's not talk about it. It's kind of like with death, people don't want to talk about it either.
So many more people are not getting married, but they're getting involved in significant relationships, and I think there's probably less sympathy when someone breaks up from a common law relationship, because there's sort of a feeling like, well, you never did get married. What's your problem? So you broke up with your boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever. It doesn't matter. Like, that must be even harder for all those folks.
Absolutely. And, we talked about the identity of being a partner, or girlfriend, or a boyfriend, that the loss of that. And of course, usually when you get into a relationship, you have a lot of hope that this might be my person. This might be the one I spend the rest of my life with, or where I
Right,
have children with, or I raise my children with, right?
right, right.
Repartnering. and finding something, you know, maybe my marriage didn't work out, but I'm going to, you know, be common law with my next partner and we're going to have a blended family. Like, oh, that's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, but, you know, that's becoming more common than just having one marriage, right? It's having serial relationships. That's kind of where we've never lived this long in history.
Right.
Our life expectancy, including for men, is almost just as high as women. And the institution of marriage, they were like, you know, to death do us part. Okay, well, 30 years. We got married at 15. We lived till 30. 15 years was doable. It was manageable.
Right.
Right? 40, 50, 60 years. I don't know. No one really, you know, talks about that. How do you manage a relationship for such a long period of time? So there's a lot of new things that are happening and different kinds of losses and grief where people are like, I don't know, I also did a interview on living apart together lots, right? Which is kind of the new demographic where women are driving this, where they could even be married, very committed relationships, but they live apart. That helps a little bit with the grief and the loss journey, because sometimes it's a little bit of a wall too. I'm going to protect myself and not, you know, do that 100% commitment so that I don't get hurt so much as well, right?
Yeah.
If that makes sense. So
we have some people watching this webinar, and I just wanted to say, if you have any questions for Minni, just post them in the chat, and I'll bring them up to Minni, and we'll see if we can get some answers out of Minni about her magic wand that she says she doesn't.
I wish. Yeah, I wish.
So children grieve differently than parents, or is it the same kind of a experience for them?
Children definitely grieve differently. And I get questions a lot about children, because that's often the first thing people are worried about when they're getting a separation and they have children. Are my kids going to be okay? Are my children going to be okay? Minni, can you talk to them? You know, can you do counseling with them? And, you know, I say to my parents, if you guys are okay, the kids will be okay. Take care of yourselves. Get your own therapy. Learn how to manage your own emotions so that you can be present to children. So the first line here is children grieve in spurts. So what that means is they might seem perfectly okay. And you're like, wow, they're handling it pretty well. That's pretty awesome. Okay. And then one day they do something that's kind of out of character or the norm of their behavior, or their grades start to drop, or they start hanging around, you know, kids that you wouldn't expect them to, things like that. So to kind of notice that. So they might be okay for a while, and then something happens. It's and then they're okay again, and then something happens. That's normal. And in fact, as a therapist, I often seen adult children who are still processing their parents' divorce from many, many years ago, and they haven't processed it. So they're still grieving the loss. And we know that children often, not all the time, lots of times they're relieved. They're very relieved their parents are separating, but there's always a secret hope, right? There's a secret hope that they're going to get back together and they're going to be happy. Not that they're going to get back together the way they were, because no child wants that, especially if there was conflict, but, you know, that they're both going to, you know, realize that they were really happy together and be happy. And even adult children feel that way, right? When their parents get divorced. So just remember that that it's going to happen. They'll be fine. Something will happen. They'll be fine. And just to be very aware of if you notice anything different, you know, out of character for them, and always keeping the dialogue open with them. If they do want to approach you, I would often say, you know, bedtimes are important. Sometimes that's where they may disclose. So having that one-on-one time with them, really, really important. And I also have to say that the way children are told about their separation is really, really important, because they usually remember that, and they remember it quite vividly. Mm-hmm. So if there's a lot of contention, anger, emotions, whatever it is that are negative, they will remember that, and they carry that, and they're coming to therapy years later trying to process it, right? So that's really important to be on the same page with the other parent when you tell the children, because that's going to really help with their grief process in the long run for sure.
Well, how do you respond to what would you say to a parent whose child is having a a moment of grief, or it seems to be upset or sad about the separation. What do you do?
So this is kind of a loaded question because it's really dependent on, number one, the child's personality, and number two, their age, right? Or their stage. So, younger children, oftentimes, reading books, and I kind of, talk about, or given some parents some tools around even sharing a story of someone but it's similar to their situation and what they did and how they felt, because kids can often relate to someone else going through it, but when you put them directly in it, it's too heavy for them. So if you say to your child, are you feeling really sad? Were you crying last night? I'm like, no, I'm fine. If they're, let's say 10 years old. But if you're like, oh yeah, when my friend's, son, when the parents separated, he would sometimes cry alone in his room. And then one day he started writing in his journal, and that made him feel a lot better. That's what my friend told me. And then you just kind of leave it there, because now their mental note, and you might want to leave a journal there for them too, rather than you should really write in your journal if you're feeling sad. You can, depending on, again, the personality of your child. If your child's
Right.
really open to stuff like that and wants to talk about it, and, that's great, and children in the same family are so different. My son was all about processing it. Mom, I need to talk about this. And my daughter's like, why would I talk about it? Like, just make me more sad, So you have to work with their personality, right? So if one is like, I don't really want to talk about it, things like journaling, having conversations through activity. So going for a drive, playing a board game, you might get a little bit more out of them because it's not as uncomfortable. They have something to kind of, that little bit of a wall or barrier to keep them safe from how they really feel. Some kids are very emotive and they're just blah, right? So that's great. So it really depends on, again, the age of your child and their personality. And this is where you want to really get a good therapist to help you kind of navigate that, right, with your children.
Yeah, we had a therapist just for our kids, and just someone that they could speak to who was not named mom or dad. And usually we didn't get much feedback from the therapist. It was all confidential,
Just for them.
it really helped the kids come to terms with it, I think.
Yeah, I think teens are, they're much more able to communicate what's going on. Younger children, I find it's difficult through play therapy, and you'd want to find a therapist who specializes in children per se. So I will work with kids 11 and up. But if they're like, my 12-year-old, 15-year-old son really needs to talk to someone about divorce, and he has asked me, then I'm cool. But if like I want my kid to go, and I'm like, well, what about you? Do you have therapy? Have you talked to someone? Are you in a good place? I always pin it on the parents, because again, kids are looking up to their parents, and they're worried. Is my mom or dad going to be okay? And if they see, okay, they're managing, they're okay, mom's okay, dad's okay, you're also teaching them coping tools, right? Then if they always leave that dialogue open. If you ever want to talk to someone, let me know, and explain to them what a therapist does. They're just an objective person, for you to vent. They might give you some tools to help you. If they say, you know what, I think I would, that's the best case scenario for children to go into therapy, right?
Bill Eddy at a presentation once said that he comforts his clients by letting them know that kids can do well if just one of the parents is mentally stable and mature. And that was such good news, because then our clients just legitimately need to work on themselves, and because they can't change their ex anyway, right? So accept that they are who they are, and they need to put that, the analogy about putting the oxygen mask on in the airplane. You got to get yourself in a good place for your children, right?
Yeah, that's such a good point, Brian. Thank you for bringing that up, because that's so true. Because we often, even as therapists, are like, oh, parents have to, and parents have to. Sometimes if there's mental health issues, addictions, or other reasons, one of the parents isn't quite on board and not able to put the anger, resentment past them. We see that all the time in collaborative meetings, right? When we're doing divorce. And so I absolutely agree. If one of the parents can step up to the plate, take care of themselves, be the one to emotionally support the kids are definitely going to be okay, because they're learning, hopefully they learn the positive coping tools, right, from that parent. Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up. That is important. So people don't feel like, because everyone's going to say, I'm the good parent. I'm the one. It's my ex who has got the problem. It's always the ex. It's never me. So, maybe that gives them some solace in knowing, okay, let's just assume that that's true. Then I need to focus on myself, not so much on my ex.
Right.
And
For
sure.
the sake of your kids,
Yeah.
So grief is all about loss, right? That's primarily what it's about. And you've got a long list of losses.
Oh, I'm sure there's many more. These are the big ones, right? And again, the first one being a full-time parent, to me, that was the biggest, most difficult and long-term loss. Meaning, if your kids are young when you divorce, you have got a long way to go when they're out of the parenting schedule, right? Very hurtful, very painful. I often share the story of pushing my children out the door when they didn't want to go, and, locking the door and then falling to the floor and just collapsing and feeling so sad, feeling so lonely, right? And those are the times where you really want to pull on your resources, because that's a huge loss, right? Being a full-time parent. Your income, your lifestyle, you have two incomes with one home when you're together, and now you have two incomes with two homes. Huge difference, unless you fall into money or have support. Often it's a really difficult transition, and that's a big loss. If you're used to, I don't know, it's a little bit elitist, but driving a nice car or going on nice vacations, and they're like, oh, well, won't be going on vacation for a long time. I remember the first few years, just like, we can go to Niagara Falls for one night, where we would be going on all inclusives or Disney World, and like one night twice a year. But you know what? Memories, there were great memories. My children actually, really have fond memories of that. So don't feel so bad if life looks different, because kids aren't really too worried about that. They're more worried about being okay. They're more worried about making memories. And then I learned, like, you know what? They're just as happy playing in the basement with their friends. why was I spending thousands of dollars all these years, right? So, just to be, again, kind and gentle with yourself. There's going to be changes. Your home may look different. You may not be able to do the things you used to do, even with the children. And I think maybe you could speak to this, Brian, too, like things like extracurricular activities that children used to do. You might not be able to afford them in the same way, but I know that judges are really, actually, we want to continue. If the kids were in extracurricular activities and quite heavily involved and at a high level, take a loan, do whatever you need to do that. But sometimes you can't, right?
Well, a lot of judges say, that it's important for kids to continue to do those activities, but maybe they can't do every one of those activities they used to. But they should have something, and it's our job as parents to find a way to keep them doing extracurricular activities, because it's so important to their development and so on. Of course.
But they may not be able to do the two that they love too. Well, you're going to have to pick one, and that's a loss for children too, right? That they grieve that, for sure.
Yeah, and not the same right now. This with the pandemic, not very many extracurricular activities that are available for kids. So we've got a reverse problem now, that we're all scrambling to figure out how to make their life feel good and full. And we've got a birthday party coming up for my daughter, and we have to figure out how to make that fun on Zoom for her and her friends, so that they feel good about it. So
people are getting creative, though, right? They're getting very creative about birthday parties online and these drive-bys and balloons and things like that. But I mean, the pandemic has, again, caused a whole other many levels. I'm not even going to say one level of loss and grief, right? And being able to cope with what we would normally, be able to manage some of these things better. Really challenging now, especially for children, right?
So all of this is making me depressed. Let's talk about some of the things that parent people can do, parents as well as others can do when they're going through a grief related to the separation and divorce.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, at the end of the day, we have to manage our stress, right? And how we manage our stress is directly related to our grief journey, how healthy we come out of it, how deep or heavy it is really dependent on our own coping tools, and also how our children fare, right? Like we said, if we're okay, our children will be okay. So, of course, the first thing I'm going to suggest to everybody is find a therapist, but one who particularly specializes in divorce. And the reason I say that is if you're talking, for example, about your parenting schedule and something in it, and you have a therapist who's not really versed on what that might look like or anything like that, they may not quite understand the impact. Whereas if there's a therapist who specializes in divorce and understands the process of the logistics, even some of the legalities of it, they're going to have a much better understanding of your grief and your losses, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. So therapy, I know that it is, if you don't have benefits, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to pay out of your pocket, but at the same time, there's so many long-term benefits from it. You have to invest in yourself. Very important. We do not think twice about getting oil changes in our cars, right? Do we? No, we just do it. Well, we need oil changes too, right? We're humans. We need help. We need support.
Right. Right.
So going to see a therapist is important.
And and along those lines, most of us go to an expert to do that oil change, right?
That's
Most of
right.
us don't try to do it ourselves, and yet some people will try to navigate the emotional journey of separation and divorce all by themselves, and it just doesn't make sense. We encourage our clients always to go to some sort of a therapist or counselor to help them through their days.
Absolutely. How do you negotiate your life and your children if you're coming from a deep emotional place, right? So you
Yeah.
want to be able to negotiate in the separation process on a level where you're stabilized, right? A bit, so you're not, anger, because you're not going to make the right decisions for your kids or even for yourself if you're coming from that place. So that's why it's important to work with a therapist, even a collaborative family professional if you're in that process, which is amazing
Yeah,
because
let's talk about that process. That's a process where you and I both do collaborative cases. How it works is each client has their own lawyer, and then they work with a therapist or what we call a family professional, and they share that family professional who helps with the emotional journey and the parenting plans and those sorts of things. And then they work with a financial specialist who helps deal with all of the financial realities. And the hallmark of the process is there's a commitment, actually a written commitment, that the parties are not going to go to court. They're committed to a settlement process. And in fact, if one of them chooses to go to court, both parties have to get new lawyers and new professionals to help them. And that's one of the great parts of collaborative practice is that commitment to settlement. So me as a lawyer, when I'm in a collaborative process, I am committed to settlement because if I don't settle the case, Minni, I lose my client, right? I don't just get to go to court with them. I lose the client completely. So I'm not going to make things worse. Some lawyers do make things worse so that they get a court case out of it. But a collaborative professional lawyer is not going to let that happen because they don't want to lose the client. They want to keep that client. And the other aspect of it is divorce is not just a legal issue. There is this huge emotional component. And it's so wonderful when they can work with somebody like you through the collaborative process so they can not be sidetracked by their emotions. And, there's a saying, Minni, that time heals everything. I always say, who wants to wait around though? Right? Go get some help. Go get some help. spend less on legal fees, and get some help, and so you can get through your separation or divorce with somebody like you.
That's such a good point because, people often view collaborative as what? There's four people, that's going to cost so much. And I'm like, no, it's so much more cost efficient because for me as a therapist, oftentimes people can use their benefits. So they're not paying anything out of pocket, right? Especially if they have good benefits or paying some. And also, we're working offline often doing the parenting plan, right? So it's not like we're always all together. And it's such a more effective way to have a separation divorce. And I think personally that families who do the collaborative process actually fare better they come out much healthier, and their grief journey is very comparatively, I wouldn't say very, but comparatively minimal to if you didn't. We know going to court is just adversarial and nothing ever good ever comes out of it. Nobody wins. Everybody loses. So there's so many benefits to collaborative, and having that support person there, the therapist, the family professional, in case emotions do run high, getting them to a level where they're able to actually accept accept that this is happening. Oftentimes the one is checked out of the marriage long before the other one is. So working with the one partner who is catching up, right? So again, so many losses, right? We didn't even get to, the other, there's so many of them, in-laws, friends, loyalties, people, so your support systems to get through the grief process might have been your friend group, right? When you were married. Well, now half of them are taking, your ex-wife's side and the other half's taking your side. But the one that you really relied on for support is no longer on your side. And that's another loss. And that's a huge loss of your support system, right? So all these things, and in terms of how you do get through this process healthier, it's a group, it's a team, it's your divorce team, your lawyers, your professionals, it's your friends, your family, it's your coping tools that are healthy. All of those are what's going to help your grief process.
And but there's all you talked about journaling. For me, it's exercise. I think that is a great way to relieve stress and elevate my mood. I read a blog by Seth Godin, and he said he says emotional regulation is a skill, and there's so many things you can do to help manage your own emotions, and you've got to learn those skills, especially during separation and divorce, don't you think?
Mm-hmm. And a pandemic, right? So if we can't go to the gym, do you do a YouTube Zumba class? Do you do a yoga class online?
No, I do not do a YouTube Zumba class.
Oh, there's so much fun. That's what's getting me through, honestly, is my Zumba classes.
But I did do yoga this morning, and that started the day off right. And I definitely will be biking in my basement before the day is gone. For sure.
Music, right? I think that's key to exercise too. If I don't have the right music on, exercise is not fun, right? So music is so therapeutic. What's your happy music? What's music that elevates your mood or changes your energy, right? Those are really important. Right. And exercise is the best medicine for your mental health. Serotonin, right? You've got happy hormones going through your body. So, and I know I'm like, oh, I can't go to the gym though. Hey, do whatever you can. I get it's hard to go for a walk outside in -20. But even if you just move, and people with my clients with young kids at home, they're doing online learning. I'm like, look, time is of the essence. You do not have the freedom to take 45 minutes of your day and do your workout because your kids are 5 and 3. Do a dance party. Put the music on, your music, not their music. Right. Right? Put it on full blast, go dance party and just get in the family room, jump around, do jumping jacks, take turns, leading the exercise. Move your body. So important, especially during the pandemic right now. I cannot stress that enough as a healing tool. Move your body. You will notice a shift in your mood pretty soon after, right? So absolutely. Yes, exercise is huge. So we talked about having your team. Again, you hit a little bit about the airplane, the oxygen theory, or the airplane. I call it the airplane theory. Is when you go on a plane and they say, if oxygen drops, please put your mask on who? Do you put it on yourself or your dependent, right? Who is it, Brian?
Put it
On yourself. What would happen if you had a 3-year-old, when you crashed into an island, you didn't survive, but your 3-year-old did? Are they going to survive on an island by themselves without you? No, right? Always put it on yourself. And this often relieves the parent guilt. Mom guilt, but also dad guilt too, where we feel a little bit selfish, like, oh, you know what, I shouldn't put myself first. Actually, it's your responsibility to take care of yourself so that you can take care of others. Okay. Right. That does not mean neglect your children because you're like, I'm doing my nails and I'm in the tub, leave me alone, have your dinner by yourself. No, it means balance. It means to teach your kids actually, you know what, mommy's going to go upstairs and have a bath. So it's mommy time. So you guys can, do your puzzle or whatever it is, right? So you're teaching your kids that it's important to take care of yourself and regulate and manage your own emotions. Very important, right? So put the mask on first. You're okay. You're good. No guilt.
Absolutely. Right? Well, I think we should end our conversation on that very positive note that everybody should take some time to go have a bath and treat themselves well with some of their own good music, and you'll be able to get through it. And you know that, I know it, with all our clients and our own personal experiences, that that this is not the book of our life. This is just a chapter of your life, and you're going to get it onto another chapter in a different place, a different feeling, and the grief will eventually diminish over time.
Gets better. It gets better. We're all going to be okay. We'll be fine. We'll get through this, right? With the right help. And thank you so much, Brian, for having me on. I really appreciate it. I love talking about this stuff because I see that there's tangible results.
Absolutely there is. And I really appreciate you being willing to share some of your ideas so that people can get through this. So thanks so much.
Thank you. All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for everyone.